Hi, everybody. Welcome. Can you see me okay? Yep, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm Vicki Elson. I'm the creative director of nuclearban.us and the executive director of the Treaty Awareness Campaign, treatyawareness.us. If you're having any technical problems, we have in the chat tech support and backup tech support. So you can contact them if you need any help. In the middle of these challenging times, I'm heartened and delighted that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is about to enter into force in the 50 ratifying countries on January 22nd, 2021. Many more countries are going to be joining in the near future. The US and the other 8 nuclear armed nations have boycotted this treaty so far, but that doesn't mean it won't have profound effects on their nuclear weapons programs. That's what today's webinar is about. How will this treaty affect the US even if we don't join it in the near future? What will change on January 22nd? This is an educational webinar and it's pretty specific. We do a lot of strategizing, campaigning, divesting, legislating, lobbying, exploring the links between nuclear weapons and the climate crisis and environmental issues and so on. And if you want to know more about that kind of stuff, a good place to start is our website, nuclearban.us. And that has links to lots of other resources as well. But today's workshop will be laser focused just on this one topic. Dr. Timmon Wallis will speak for about 40 minutes, and there will be about 20 minutes for questions. Please put your questions and comments in the chat. Timmon won't be able to read them while he's giving his presentation, but when he's done, our campaign assistant, Hawaini Herrera-Diaz, will read some of your questions for Timmon to answer until the webinar officially ends at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. For those of you who want to stick around for more questions, we'll keep going after that. The webinar is being recorded and will be available later. Timmon Wallis is the executive director of nuclearban.us. He holds a PhD in peace studies from Bradford University in England. His book, Disarming the Nuclear Argument, The Truth About Nuclear Weapons, analyzes the cost, accident risk, and legality of nuclear weapons and the absurdity of the whole concept of perpetuating nuclear weapons as, quote, deterrence. The book played a role in the successful 2017 negotiations for the nuclear ban treaty, and it's a handbook for those seeking a saner, safer world. Timmon represented the Quakers at the treaty negotiations at the United Nations, and he has more than 45 years of experience working on this issue. He was at the UN on that historic day, 7/7/17, when the nuclear ban treaty was adopted by 122 nations. He brought me to the UN on that day. It was our 4th date, and I haven't been the same since. Timmon.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining. Please mute yourself if you're not already muted, and put your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end. And if we don't get to everybody's questions, we will do our best to contact you and answer your questions. So I'm going to run through the presentation about the treaty. I think we're going to have a little bit of a problem with the technical thing because every time somebody's entering, it messes up the slides. But anyway, never mind. So we're talking about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which, as Vicki said, was agreed 3 years ago. And in 36 days, 13 hours, and 52 minutes, it is going to enter into force. So that's very exciting. But what exactly does that mean? That's what we want to talk about tonight. So I'm going to talk about what the treaty is and what it is not, because there's a lot of confusion and misunderstandings about that, what it actually says, the process of actually creating and implementing a treaty like this, what is going to happen on January 22nd, and what happens in the subsequent months and years after that, and what does this all mean for the US in particular. So I hope this is what you came to listen about, because this is what we're going to cover. So firstly, what this treaty is not. And much as we love the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN, this is not an ICAN treaty. ICAN got the Nobel Peace Prize for their role in helping make this happen, but it is not a peace movement document. It is not a peace movement or ICAN treaty. It is a treaty between governments. But it's also not a treaty of the United Nations General Assembly. And it's not really correct to call it a UN treaty at all, because people, when you say UN, people think either of the Security Council, and none of those members have had anything to do with this treaty, which I'll come on to later, or they think of the General Assembly, which you may or may not know passes resolutions about abolishing nuclear weapons every single year, many of them. They just passed about 10 resolutions, and always by huge majorities, because the UN was set up in 1945. The very first resolution of the UN General Assembly was to abolish nuclear weapons, and they've been calling on that ever since. So this is not just a call from the UN General Assembly. This is a treaty between sovereign countries. That is it's a contract. It's a contract that is legally binding. It's to do with the countries that actually take part in it. And although it is correct that it's also part of international law, we're not going to be talking about international law as such tonight. We're going to be talking about how this treaty impacts the countries that actually sign it and ratify it. And with all legal documents, there are consequences for violating a treaty. And that's, again, a big difference between passing resolutions and fine words and actually signing and ratifying a treaty, which puts it into legal language. And there are consequences, and we're going to be talking about what those consequences are. But of course, it's also true that treaties, like any other law, has its skeptics and detractors. This newspaper article, I don't know if you can see, it's dated 1929 or something, or maybe 39. Anyway, it was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It was signed just before World War II. All the countries, Germany, US, France, Britain, they all signed this treaty saying they would not go to war. And of course, a few years later, they did. And we all know that other treaties have been broken. Our current, very soon to be gone president has broken other treaties. And so, people legitimately ask, well, what's the point of a treaty when they can just be broken? But the answer to that, one answer is that we have nothing else. The international community, the world community, has nothing besides treaties to hold everything that we do together. And that means everything from getting our letters sent to other countries, flying to other countries, flying over other countries to get to a different country, the internet, everything that we do outside of the United States involves some treaty or another. And there are thousands of them, and most of them work most of the time. So treaties are important, even if they're limited. And this particular treaty belongs to a class of treaties which is about specific weapon systems. And as you can see here, biological weapons and chemical weapons are normally categorized with nuclear weapons as weapons of mass destruction. Landmines and cluster bombs are also weapons of indiscriminate nature that disproportionately harm civilians, including civilians long after the war is over, from remnants of war. So these are all treaties that have banned weapons that are inhumane and considered unacceptable by the international community. And they all stem from the same international precedents, which go back, not just decades or hundreds of years, but literally thousands of years. These principles have been in place. And they're not just about international law, because as I'll show you, they're directly incorporated into the laws of the United States military in the Law of War Manual. These are the fundamental principles of I don't know how you pronounce juice in bello, but anyway, use or juice or whatever. But this is about the rules of war, and they are broken, but they are broken with consequences. And the very first principle is the principle of distinction, which means that all armed forces are supposed to distinguish between competence and non-competence or civilians, and they must always target military targets and not civilian targets. That's a fundamental principle. It means that it is illegal and always has been illegal to target a city, for example, whether that's with a nuclear weapon, as in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or whether it's with conventional weapons like the firebombing of Tokyo or Dresden or Berlin. Those are illegal under international law. But of course, that's where we come into the question about how they get enforced. But proportionality is another one which directly relates to nuclear weapons and these other types of weapons, because it says even if you are using targeting a military target, you must be proportional to the goal that you're trying to achieve, and especially in terms of how much so-called collateral damage to civilians. So even if you don't target civilians, if you bomb a military target that happens to be inside the middle of a city, and you kill lots of civilians, that is also illegal under international law and always has been. Military necessity is a very interesting concept to me. I've been reading this Law of War manual, and I must admit it's pretty fascinating. I don't recommend it as bedtime reading. It's 1,000 pages of how they're supposed to fight wars. This is the United States military, but military necessity is the concept that all military fighting must be justified by achieving some kind of military goal, whether it's to take over the enemy forces or whatever. And only if there is a military goal is military force legal. So when we talk about nuclear weapons, for instance, and people say, well, we want to have nuclear weapons, we don't want to use them first, we only want to use them in retaliation for another country using them. Retaliation in that sense is actually illegal and always has been under these principles, because you're not achieving a military goal by doing that. You're retaliating, and there are some very specific circumstances where that's allowed, but it's basically illegal. And then it goes on to other, humanity, which is kind of a weird term to use in the case of war where everybody's being killed, but it is about superfluous and unnecessary suffering, not just to civilians, but to combatants. So the idea that chemical and biological and the radiation effects of nuclear weapons that can last through generations, that can affect for years and years later, those are illegal also under these terms. So honor is more about how you treat prisoners of war and all that sort of thing. But just to be clear, most of these principles, as I said, are in the US War Manual, and the US War Manual is based on treaties that the US has signed and ratified, and those treaties under US law are part of the supreme law of the land, which is straight out of the US Constitution. So these are not insignificant treaties, and of course, if things were going the way they should, then there would be prosecutions when the US government or other high-level officials break those laws. But anyway, we're now moving on from the Department of Defense War Manual to looking at how nuclear weapons under existing law in the United States, the use. So what I'm saying here is almost all conceivable uses of nuclear weapons are already illegal because they do not discriminate between civilians and combatants, because they cause way disproportionate harm, because they affect even soldiers with long-lasting suffering, and they cause all kinds of other things which break treaties. So the only reason that we're even having this discussion about the legality of nuclear weapons is because they came up with some fairly far-fetched hypothetical examples of where nuclear weapons might be legal. And that is in the case, for instance, of a nuclear submarine out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about to threaten the United States with total destruction with nuclear weapons. And if we attacked them and none of the radiation got anywhere near civilians and it just stopped the submarine from launching their nuclear weapons, that might be legal. The same if they were on a desert, in the middle of a desert, and it was nowhere near civilians and nowhere near other third-party neutral countries and so on. There's so many conditions that have to be applied that they're very, very unlikely situations. Belligerent reprisal, I'm not going to talk about. You can ask a question if you want, but it's a kind of again, it's a very odd, weird case where they argue this is the military, the U.S. government argues that it could be legal. But just to take an example, so this is a map of the military targets that just happen to be near Moscow. So these are targets from the U.S. nuclear weapons targeting. There's 16 high-level prime targets for nuclear weapons to strike Moscow. These are, even if they're not attacking a city as such, they're supposedly legally targeting military targets. And nevertheless, you're going to cause, if you look down there at the bottom, and this is where I'm going to use my new toy, look at that, 2.5 million civilians would be dead immediately just from targeting military targets. And that is where the disproportionate comes in. So, like I said, ideally, the U.S. courts, the Supreme Court, would take these kinds of cases and say, well, you're breaking not just international law, but U.S. law. And this is a case, I don't know if people know about it or remember it, but Pinochet, who was the dictator in Chile, was wanted for war crimes by Spain. He happened to be visiting his buddy, Mrs. Thatcher, in London, and he was arrested because he was wanted for war crimes in Spain. He spent a year in jail, and then they let him out because of his ill health, and he died. But this is an example of where even a president of another country can be arrested for war crimes in another country. And this is the case right now with the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is not recognized by the United States, but nevertheless, it is recognized by literally all our allies except for one, which happens to be Israel. But all of the European allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all of our most important allies of the United States are in the International Criminal Court. And if the US were to use a nuclear weapon, for instance, which is a war crime, the president of the United States could be arrested in any of those countries and charged with war crimes under the International Criminal Court and go to jail, even though the US is not part of the criminal court. So that's just an example of how these laws can affect even the United States. So just to summarize where we are so far, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, or Nuclear Ban Treaty, or whatever else you'd like to call it, is not principally about making the use or the threat of use of nuclear weapons illegal, because that already was illegal. It's also not principally about establishing a legal precedent in international law, since that already exists. So what we're talking about tonight is making everything to do with nuclear weapons illegal, not just using them. That is what is different, and especially about assisting others to engage in anything to do with nuclear weapons, which is the key clause in this treaty, which we're going to talk about in this moment. It also makes these things illegal in domestic law in those countries that are in the treaty. They're called the states parties to the treaty. It's not just about international law and some vague, who's going to enforce it. It's about the law in that country and making that illegal and holding people accountable. And that includes assigning criminal penalties for breaking that law. So the treaty, and I've, this is the treaty. We got lots of copies of these for everybody who would like to order one from our website. You can also download it and print it yourself. But this specifies what is prohibited under this treaty, and it's all the things that collectively add up to everything to do with nuclear weapons. You can't develop them, you can't test them, you can't produce them, you can't get them from some other way, you can't hold on to them, you can't transfer them, you can't use them or threaten anybody with them, you can't station them, you can't deploy them. But the key thing is that you also cannot assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any activity that is prohibited under this treaty. So this is called the Assistance Clause. It's Article 1E in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but it's in a number of other treaties, which is very handy because it enables us to actually know how different countries are going to handle that. But when we talk about assistance, we're not talking about other countries. We're talking about who actually is making these nuclear weapons. And in most cases, they are private companies and individuals who are involved in the nuclear weapons business. I mean, some countries like North Korea, it's all done in secret and it's all done by the government, and we don't have any control over that. But in almost every country, every other country, including China and even Russia, there are companies involved, and especially in the United States, there are about 15 of those companies that directly contract to make parts for nuclear weapons, to develop them and to design them and to maintain them. And these are the companies that are going to be directly affected by this treaty. So for example, this is Airbus. It's a nuclear weapons producer, and you can see their global reach. They're not just, I mean, Airbus is based in the Netherlands, even though they're making nuclear weapons, parts for nuclear weapons for the United States, as well as for France and for the UK. So they got their hands full. But these are companies that operate all over the world. And that is why they're going to be affected, because even though the United States doesn't sign this treaty, if, for instance, and let me get my handy little thing down here. Okay, Venezuela has already signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so on January 22nd, Airbus is potentially breaking the law in Venezuela. What does that mean? That is where we're going to go. So these companies mostly make military things, okay? And some of them only make military things, but they don't just make military things for the United States. They also make them for other countries. And they also make other things, most of them. So for instance, Boeing, as you all know, makes airplanes. And in some countries, those airplanes are owned and operated by the government. This is Uganda Airlines. You know, once Uganda signs the treaty, what is it going to mean that they're buying planes from a nuclear weapons company? But they don't just make airplanes, they make whole airports. They design and build, gigantic, huge projects, which most countries can't manage without. They build highways, they build bridges, they build tunnels, they build railway stations, they build electricity pylons, they build medical equipment for hospitals. And here's our favorite one, Honeywell, who has been a big target of our campaign. They make all kinds of equipment that are bought and sold to countries as well as to other large institutions, including Draper Labs in Boston. They make tiny heart valves for children, and they make nuclear weapons. So the big question is, when it says that the treaty says that it's illegal to assist anyone to have anything to do with nuclear weapons, does that include working for these companies, buying products from them, supplying to these companies, entering into other relations with these companies? Well, as I said, we don't have to just ask that in the abstract, because we have other treaties that we can build a case from. So one of the other treaties is the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which was agreed a few years ago. And already 28 of the countries that have ratified that treaty have issued statements saying that the assistance clause, which is identical to the one that we're talking about, the exact same wording, that assistance clause means investment in the production of cluster munitions is prohibited by the convention. So investment is one of the things that is absolutely on the table for being prohibited as a means of assisting these companies. Some countries prohibit both public investment and also private investment. And we're going to look at some examples in a moment. Switzerland prohibits participation in the companies that develop, manufacture, or acquire prohibited war material. And interestingly, that includes nuclear weapons, but we're going to come on to that in a moment. So investments are a very, very key area where the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the Assistance Clause directly impacts on these companies. There are literally billions and billions of dollars invested in these companies. And you can see here some of the numbers. I mean, Boeing, $641 billion of investments, Honeywell, $585 billion, and so on. So to summarize where we are right now, the treaty prohibits everything to do with nuclear weapons, including assisting anybody at all in having anything to do with these weapons. It doesn't refer only to countries, but to anyone engaged in these activities, and it makes those activities illegal under the domestic law of the countries involved, and that it's up to those countries to impose penalties for violating that law. So before I go on to look at what the penalties are, I just want to review the process, because I know a lot of people have been confused by all the different numbers that are thrown around about the nuclear ban treaty. It was adopted in 2017 by 122 countries. That is just the first step of any treaty. They got to agree the wording and they got to vote on it. Then the two main parts of a treaty are you sign it, which is an indication of your commitment to it, but it doesn't hold you to anything legally. And then you have to ratify it, which is where you enter into the treaty legally. You are legally bound by its conditions, and then you must enforce that into your own national legislation and enforce it. So to give you some examples, here's the treaty in 2017 that Vicky mentioned at the beginning. The negotiations going on, organizations, members of ICANN, churches, other faith communities, Quakers, we were all involved in supporting the countries that were negotiating this treaty, but it's ultimately the countries that decide and they vote on it and they adopted it. And one of my favorite moments in that process was when the US government, led by the US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley at the time, held a protest outside the UN, protesting what was going on inside. And that was very exciting for me because I've spent a lot of time protesting outside buildings where the governments are doing something. And this time we were on the inside and the US government was on the outside. That was really exciting. But then the first step after that is it's got to be signed. And it's not just anybody who signs treaties. It's presidents and prime ministers. This, in the first signature for the TPNW was the president of Brazil, just prior to the current president of Brazil, who probably wouldn't have signed it, but we got a signature. But look at the list of presidents and prime ministers, ministers of foreign affairs, very, very high level people signing a treaty, giving their country's commitment to it. It's a very, very high level commitment. And then it has to be ratified. Now, this is the US Congress. And as you probably know, just for the US to ratify a treaty requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate, which is why it's been decades since the Senate has ratified a treaty, because they don't get a 2/3 majority for many things. And there's a lot of disagreement about treaties in the US. So it's incredibly difficult to get a treaty ratified in the US, let alone all these other countries. They have to go through their parliaments or their Congress. They got to go through all the steps of committees and everything else, and then they got to vote on it. And they need a 2/3 majority. And some countries require a vote in both houses of their parliament or whatever. It's a long, cumbersome process. It's taken 3 years to get that through to the point where we are now with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But that's not just because of the process, that's also because of the pressure that the US and other governments have been putting on these countries not to sign and ratify. And it may shock you to know that the current administration was not only trying to stop countries from ratifying this treaty, but it was actually trying to get them to unratify the ones that had already ratified, which is a totally unprecedented and actually very seriously dangerous step that the government of the United States took, because it's undermining the whole basis of international agreements. And here's a quote from the letter that the U.S. administration sent out, saying, we believe you have made a strategic error and should withdraw your instrument of ratification. Now, I want to give you an example. So they didn't do that. Obviously, they're still signing and ratifying. We had the 51st ratification just a couple of days ago, but I want to just give you an example from Malta, because I happen to know a little bit about this one. We spent a lot of time lobbying the UN mission of Malta. The ambassador read my book on nuclear weapons, which I was pretty excited about, because I don't think many other people have. But anyway, he read it, and they were very, very supportive of the treaty. They voted for it in the UN, and then he told me directly, we can't sign this. We can't sign this treaty we can't ratify it, because the United Kingdom, in this case, has huge influence over Malta. Malta is a very small island. They depend, it's English speaking. They depend on the UK for a lot of their economy and their political situation. And the UK was putting pressure on Malta not to sign or ratify the treaty. And the reason I give you this as an example is because they just ratified, and this is the only example I can think of where Brexit actually helped, because they're too busy trying to sort out Brexit in Britain, and Malta slipped in and ratified the treaty while they weren't looking. So that's good. Now we come to the really exciting part. This is the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Act 2019 from Ireland. Now, Ireland is one of the leading countries in this process. They're part of the core team of countries that really pushed the treaty through. And Ireland has already made into their own domestic law this treaty, into this Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Act. So this is already law in Ireland. And I just want to point out what that says in that law. So first of all, it says, it shall be an offense for a person to develop, produce, manufacture, blah, 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 anything to do with nuclear weapons. A person, not a country, a person. And then it says under the next item, if that person happens to be a corporation, then the director, manager, secretary, or other officer can also be liable for the offense. So persons, corporations, and individuals in those corporations are all liable for having anything to do with nuclear weapons, including assisting anything to do with nuclear weapons. Now, what I'm excited about is what is the penalty for violating this law, which is already in place in Ireland. A person guilty of an offense under this law shall be liable on conviction to a fine or imprisonment for life, or such lesser term as the court may determine. Imprisonment for life. That's the penalty for breaking this law in Ireland, potentially. I mean, I don't know how things work in Ireland, but it sounds pretty scary to me. And if I were the CEO of Honeywell, I wouldn't necessarily want to go to Ireland right now, because this is just the first country. They didn't have to do this yet. It doesn't enter into force until January, but Ireland is already one step ahead. Now, if we look at the penalties, I mentioned about the cluster munitions treaty and also the landmines treaty. There are a number of treaties that have used the exact same language about being illegal to assist anybody and having anything to do with these weapons. And these are some of the penalties in some other countries for investment, just investment. If you invest in a cluster munitions company in Belgium, you are liable to a sentence in jail of 1 month to 5 years. Well, that's a lot better than Ireland, obviously. But then you look at Italy and you're being charged, up to 500,000 euros, or down in Netherlands, up to €1 million in fine. Spain, 5 to 10 years in prison. Switzerland, up to 5 years, or a monetary penalty. These are the kinds of legal consequences in countries that have signed and ratified treaties like this one. and we're going to have to wait and see how these countries interpret this treaty. But this is the kind of thing that you can expect. Now, in Switzerland, it's very interesting to me, anyway, that they passed this law back in 1996 when the landmines treaty came in. They said we're not going to allow any direct financing or even indirect financing of these companies. And they already in 1996 made that apply to investments in nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, anti-personnel mines, and cluster munitions. So they're way ahead of the game. We didn't even have cluster munitions weren't even on the list yet, let alone nuclear weapons. And it's already been in the Swiss law that you can't invest in these companies for over 20 years. So that's pretty impressive. And I wouldn't put your money in a Swiss bank account either if you're a CEO of Honeywell. So what happens now as of January 22nd? We know that these countries are going to implement the treaty into their own law, like Ireland did. We know that it's going to be illegal to have anything to do with the nuclear weapons or to assist anybody else in having anything to do with these weapons. And let's have a look at, I'm going to look at these 5 different cases. They're all, we know what's going to happen on January 22nd. We don't know when the next batch of countries is going to ratify, but we know they're already in the process. So that's going to happen fairly soon. And we also know that there are other countries that we'll talk about in a moment that are closer than you might think to actually being part of this treaty. So this is the first 50 states parties or countries that are going to be part of this treaty on January 22nd. And it may not look like 50 because a lot of them are small islands, and I'm going to show you the list in a moment. But I just want to point out that this does include 3 of the 10 largest countries in the world, most populous countries rather. Mexico, Nigeria, and Bangladesh are all in the top 10 most populous countries in the world. Kazakhstan, which looks really huge here, is actually pretty small in terms of population. But there are other countries here that matter a great deal. I mentioned Ireland already. Ireland is right here, and Austria. These are 2 key countries in Europe. They're not in NATO, which we're going to talk about in a moment, but they are in Europe, and that makes them very important. And also New Zealand way down here, which is in a military alliance with the United States right now. Other countries that really make a big difference in terms of financing and investments and so on are Thailand, Malaysia, South Africa is a very important country. But there's a limit. This is the beginning, and these are the countries in total. You can see they range from like Bangladesh, which I think is the 6th largest country in the world with almost as many people as the United States, to a little tiny island called Niue, which I never even heard of, which has, I think it's 1,456 people or something. It's very small, but it doesn't matter because they all get to sign the treaty and ratify it, and all we need was 50. But New Zealand, as I mentioned, is in a nuclear alliance with the United States. Now, they have refused to allow nuclear weapons in New Zealand since the 1980s. And you can see here, there were protests which led to New Zealand being the only country in the entire world that stood up to the United States and said, we're not having anything to do with nuclear weapons. This was way back in the 80s. Now, since then, they've rejoined the ANZUS alliance with the United States, and that's only because the United States no longer carries nuclear weapons on their ships. They still have nuclear submarines, and they're not allowed anywhere near New Zealand, but they don't have them on their big surface ships at the moment, and so they could rejoin that. But what's it going to mean when New Zealand now puts this treaty into international law and says we can't have anything to do with your nuclear weapons? This is Shannon Airport in Ireland. Now, Ireland is a neutral country. It's not in NATO. It has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. It's a big partner in this treaty, as you saw. But the US uses Shannon Airport to refuel planes going to Syria and Iraq and places like that to drop weapons or to deliver materials. And so again, there's a big question about what that's going to mean when it comes to not not assisting or having anything to do with nuclear weapons. But the big issue is going to be the companies. And so here we are with Honeywell, one of our main targets here in the United States. Honeywell has operations in 110 countries. And if you look right away, you can see South Africa's there, and Malaysia's there, and New Zealand's there, and all these countries in Latin America, Mexico. You know, this company is breaking the law in 13 of these countries on January 22nd. So the question is, what will happen? Same with Jacob Engineering. You can see again, this is, well, anyway, South Africa, Thailand, and so on. And again, Fluor, which is a nuclear, they mainly make nuclear power plants, but they're also involved in the nuclear weapons industry. And again, companies all over the world. These companies are going to be breaking the law in these other countries. And this even includes, so this is an Indian nuclear weapons manufacturer, Walter Janger Industries. And they're, again, in Nigeria has already ratified the treaty, Guyana, Malaysia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, even these companies in India are going to be affected by their operations in these other countries. And that's just these first 50 initial countries. But then we add the countries that are already in the process of ratifying this treaty, and that's another 35. So we're up to about 85 or 86 countries, and you can see right away there's some big ones. Brazil, which is one of the largest, most populous countries in the world, and Indonesia, which is actually the fourth largest next to the United States in terms of population. These are very, very key countries, but you can also see more countries in Latin America, more countries in Africa, more countries in Asia. And these are all going to add to the pressure on these companies, because you can see right away General Dynamics is in Brazil, and Leidos is in Brazil, and Lockheed Martin is in Brazil. So these companies are all over the map. Thales, Brazil, and so on. And now we come to the next level, which is the countries that support the treaty through votes at the United Nations. They voted to adopt the treaty. They were among the 122 countries that voted to adopt it. And many of these countries have voted ever since then to encourage other countries to sign and ratify, even though they haven't yet. And this is a list of the countries. This is just from last week. This was a vote in the UN General Assembly asking countries to sign and ratify the treaty. And you can see all the green pluses are all the countries that voted yes. Some key countries abstained, with the yellow X. And then all the countries that are still opposed are the ones basically in NATO, which we're going to talk about. So these include, I'll just go back one second. So the big thing to watch here is all these countries here in the Middle East, because this is a key area in terms of financing, all the oil money, all the big kingdoms, putting money into military. And you can see right away, these companies are big time invested and committed to this part of the world. So these are, again, going to increase enormously the impact on these companies. Northrop Grumman, and so on and so on, including not just U.S. companies, but even China has companies in Jordan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, a big investment in Argentina, which is on that list, and Russia. This is a airline company in Russia. I mean, not an airline, but a plane manufacturing company that also makes nuclear weapons for Russia. And you can see down at the bottom, Peru, Egypt, Kazakhstan. These are all countries that are in the process of signing or already ratifying this treaty. Then we get to the countries that are one election away, which is what's most exciting for me personally, because they're starting to get big time in Europe. Oops, I missed out Spain, very important, Spain. Now these countries, I'm running out of time already, but I want to just tell you a little bit about these countries, because Norway, for instance, which is a member of NATO, initiated the entire process that led to this treaty. They started the first conference was held in Oslo. And then they had an election and a change of government, and now Norway is not supporting the treaty. But it's only a matter of time. They have elections coming up in September. They could elect the left-wing party as the head of the government that was there before. They might not, we don't know. But if they do, they will sign and ratify the treaty, and Norway will be the first NATO country. Germany, which has US weapons on their soil, you may have read recently the leading opposition party there, the SDP, is actually opposed to continuing that arrangement with the US. They don't want nuclear weapons anymore on German soil. There's huge opposition to that within Germany. And in fact, they had, during the last election, they had negotiations with the the coalition government of Angela Merkel had negotiations with other parties where they discussed whether Germany would sign and ratify this treaty. Now, the elections coming up are very, very likely. I mean, there's no knowing, but at the moment, it's very possible that the Green Party will have will be needed to be part of the coalition in Germany, and they have so far said they will only do that if Germany signs this treaty. Now, all of that is up for grabs. We don't know. The same thing happened in Spain with the Podemos party, which is a sort of Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders kind of party in Spain. They're in the coalition government with the Socialist Party. They said they would demand Spain joins the treaty, but we're still waiting. Australia, had elections. We thought they might actually elect the Labour Party in government in Australia last year, and they were already committed to signing the treaty. Netherlands is another one. There's so much going on, and that's not even taking into account the huge public opinion that there is in many of these countries, not just in the parliaments, but huge opposition to nuclear weapons. Finland, 84% support Finland signing the TPNW and ratifying it. Belgium, the last slide I did for this, the Belgian opinion poll was 62%. And then last week they did a new poll and it's 77% support Belgium signing the TPNW. And in fact, the Belgian government has committed itself already to looking into how they can support the TPNW. Italy, 70%. We're going to talk about how many parliamentarians support this. Japan, the Japanese government is in between a rock and a hard place because their people totally support nuclear abolition. Japan suffered the consequences of nuclear weapons directly in the Second World War, but their government is very supportive of the US and under a lot of pressure from the US. And same with Canada, 88%. That's a while ago, but still there's very strong support in many of these countries for this treaty. And I'm personally pinning my hope on this person here. Her name is Katrín Jakobsdóttir, and she's the Prime Minister of Iceland. She's one of the youngest prime ministers in the world right now. She's very much like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's very, very radical and progressive. She personally has signed the ICANN pledge, as have almost half of her members of parliament. And Iceland could very well be the first NATO country to sign the treaty. The ICANN pledges, here's just some lists, but you can see down at the bottom, Italy, 243 members of parliament in Italy have signed the ICANN pledge saying that they support their country ratifying this treaty. So I'm going to skip over a bit of this. This is all about NATO and the fact that they all have different policies and positions when it comes to nuclear weapons. It's not anything unusual that some of these countries would support the treaty and still be in NATO. Spain and Lithuania have it written into their constitution that they will have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Other countries have refused to have nuclear weapons on their soil. Only 5 European countries actually have US nuclear weapons. And as I said, Germany doesn't want them anymore. Belgium is probably going to say the same thing. Netherlands and Italy are not very far behind. So this is all about to change. And we don't know when, but we're moving in that direction. So as more and more countries join this treaty, especially in Europe, the impacts of the treaty are going to be felt on the United States because of the allies in NATO and so on, because it's undermining the whole rationale for why we have these weapons, and especially because it's putting pressure on these companies. And there's a whole host of reasons why these companies are coming under pressure. It's not just because of divestment, although divestment is kind of the front line of this. But there's all these risks that these companies are under when nuclear weapons start to be outlawed in different countries. And that's, I mean, legislative risk is the obvious one, where, you know, what you're doing is suddenly illegal in a country. What does that mean for your bottom line as a company? And we're already seeing more and more large institutions divesting from nuclear weapons. This is the last Hall of Fame from Don't Bank on the Bomb in the Netherlands. 2 of the 5 largest pension funds in the world are on this list who divested from nuclear weapons. Deutsche Bank, one of the largest banks in Germany, has divested. Resona Holdings in Japan has divested. You can see there the Bank of Australia. You know, it's a growing, rapidly growing movement that's going to really impact on these companies, especially now that they're being declared illegal in 50 countries and soon to be 85, and before we know it, 135 and more. So nuclear weapons gets put on the list of controversial weapons along with all the other controversial weapons, and this is where we get. This is New York City. Now we're moving back to the United States just to see how this is impacting here. New York City has a supermajority in the city council ready to vote to divest the New York City pension fund from the nuclear weapons companies. That's going to be huge. And we're just waiting for that to happen. It was all set to happen before the COVID struck, and we're just waiting. Northampton, our own town here in Massachusetts, has not only divested from nuclear weapons, but we've just got the authorization from the states to be able to refuse contracts with these companies. And that is another piece of this puzzle, which the other countries are going to be doing when they start looking at assistance. And what does assistance mean? Well, in the 1980s, there were many nuclear-free zones in the United States who were passing legislation that specifically prohibited investment, but also prohibited contracts with these companies, which prohibited other kinds of connections or support to these companies. Oakland is one of the examples, but there was also Chicago and then many other large and small small towns and medium-sized towns, as well as some counties who passed this kind of legislation. This is just a graphic list of the 200 nuclear-free zones from the 1980s that passed legislation, not just resolutions, but legally binding legislation, just like we're talking about with the treaty. So we have, as the treaty has the first step being to sign it, which is like making a moral commitment to it, like a resolution in a town, you know, we resolve, we want the US to sign this treaty or whatever. But then there's the second step of ratifying the treaty, which is like putting these laws into place, legally binding legislation that has legal consequences for violating it. And that is where we get to real effective change stemming from this treaty. So to end, this is our dove of peace. This is a bit like signing the treaty. It's a bit like passing resolutions in your city council. You know, we want a more peaceful world, but we need not just peace and not just a dove. We need a dove with teeth. We need legislation that's legally binding, that actually puts pressure on these companies, because that is what the treaty is going to be doing all over the world. And if we can multiply that here in the US, we can really defeat these dreadful weapons that must end before they end us. So thank you very much. I've gone a bit over my time, but we have a few minutes to take some questions. And then if people want to stay, then we can carry on having the discussion. But we said we would try to finish after an hour, because Zoom gets a bit difficult to cope with after a while. So I'm going to hand over to Hawaii, who has been trying to capture the the questions and figure out. We've got a lot of messages in here, so I hope she's been able to figure that out. Over to you, Hoani.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hawaini Herrera Diaz. I've been the campaign assistant at nuclearban.us, the US. Thanks you for submitting questions in the chat. Now, before we get to your questions, we just want to let you know the things that we're planning. That we're planning more webinars on suggested actions for January 22nd, the day that the treaty enters into force, how to nudge the Biden administration and other legislators toward nuclear abolition, federal, state, and city legislation about compliance with the treaty, our report W2W, debunking the myth of nuclear deterrence, divestment campaigns, and how you can speed up the elimination of nuclear weapons and more. Now, to get to your questions, so James asked, what mechanisms of enforcement will be available to bring the nuclear nations to reduce/abolish their nuclear stockpiles?
Okay, am I still on? Yeah, I guess I am. As I tried to explain, the problem with international law is that the only way to enforce international law is through the United Nations Security Council, and 5 countries have veto power there, and one of them is the United States, and so there is virtually no way to force the United States right now to do anything. That's the reality we live in. That's why I'm pointing to the way this treaty is going to impact on the companies in all these different countries. And that pressure on the companies is ultimately what we think is going to change US policy and eventually get rid of nuclear weapons in those other countries as well, because the companies have so much influence and pressure on our own politicians here in Washington. It's the companies that are making literally trillions of dollars from these contracts to build nuclear weapons and just want to keep on, they just want the gravy train to keep going. And unless we put pressure on these companies, we are not going to change that. That's simply, it's all very fine to have politicians, saying they'll do this or that, but they will not change the fundamental situation that we have in the US, where the companies are getting all this money and they use it to bribe our politicians to keep carrying on doing what they're doing. So that's how we're ultimately going to get rid of these weapons, I believe, is by putting pressure on the companies. There's the pressure coming from these other countries already, and that was going to increase enormously, as I was trying to illustrate. And once we can multiply that here in the US with pressure on the companies, we have a chance, I think, a fighting chance of getting the companies to turn around and say to Biden, we got to do something. Let's get rid of these things. And let's use that money for climate change and all these other things that we need the money and the brain power and everything else for.
Christine asked, what would the penalty be for member states of the treaty that do not penalize their citizens for violating it? Can the case be taken to the ICJ?
Well, so, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which is different from the criminal court. The criminal court can try individuals. The ICJ only tries countries. And again, it comes down to the enforcement of that. The World Court can say, well, you're not abiding by the treaty, but to enforce anything like that requires the Security Council and it requires the United States. And so it's not going to happen. The only way we can force any of these countries to do anything is through the pressure of other countries and the commitment they have to this treaty. And the reality is, these countries that have signed and ratified, as I said, they've done so already against enormous pressures from the US and these other nuclear countries. They've stood up and they've said, we don't care what you say. We've heard stories of ambassadors that have been told, your son's not going to be able to go to Harvard if you vote for this treaty, and other countries that have been told, you're not going to get your aid from USAID if you vote for this treaty. They're putting all kinds of pressures on these countries and they're still signing and ratifying. So these countries are committed. And if they're committed, then we've got to trust that they're going to, push each other to do what the treaty says. That's the best we have. You got some more?
Yes. Christine and a few other people in the chat asked if they will be getting the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, so we're videoing this presentation and we will make that available. The PowerPoint I can make available. It's a very big file, but the video is probably easier to manage. But yeah, you can be in touch with us and we can figure that out.
Cole asked if a nuclear umbrella state such as Japan or one that hosts NWs like Germany joined the TPNW, what is the process they are to undergo to come into compliance?
Okay, so there is the whole process. I mean, a lot of the treaty, as I said, this is the treaty here, and a big chunk of it is the process, and there's more than one actually to choose from as to how states can come into compliance if they actually have nuclear weapons, or they are hosting nuclear weapons, or they're in a nuclear alliance. I mean, the alliance part is quite easy because neither the US-Japan mutual aid agreement or whatever it's called, nor NATO, the actual agreement, says that they have to have nuclear weapons or anything to do with nuclear weapons. Japan, in their constitution, doesn't allow nuclear weapons, doesn't allow Japan to have anything to do with nuclear weapons already. So they've had US nuclear weapons in Okinawa illegally, but the Japanese government, under their constitution, is not allowed to do that. So Japan is easier than, say, Germany, because Germany would have to remove the nuclear weapons from their soil. And as I mentioned, the main opposition party in Germany has already said that that's what they want to do. Whether they'll follow through with that, we don't know. But even before they sign the treaty, they will probably tell the United States that they have to move those weapons out of Germany. That's already happened in other countries. This the slide that I skipped over is with the NATO countries. Greece and Canada both had nuclear weapons on their soil, US nuclear weapons as part of NATO, and they both decided at different times they don't want them anymore, and the US had to remove them. So this is nothing unusual. It's the same thing happened in South Korea. The US moved unilaterally in that case, moved their nuclear weapons out of South Korea, and South Korea doesn't want them back. So, it's part of the treaty that they would have to do that. And they would do it. There's a process in there, and there's compliance issues with the International Atomic Energy Agency, where they have to have safeguards and sign all kinds of things, and there has to be inspections and monitors. All that is part of the arrangement that would be in place if a country that has nuclear weapons or is connected to nuclear weapons joins up. You ready for the last question? Yeah. You're muted, Hawaii.
Sorry. The last question is, how can I learn more and stay in the loop with nuclearband.us?
Oh, I can answer that one.
Okay.
Hi again. Okay, we've taken the liberty of adding you to our occasional email list. We don't share it, we don't abuse it. If you want to unsubscribe, you certainly can. But that will give you a way to get to the recording of this, and we'll keep you posted about all kinds of other things that are going on. We'll let you know about future webinars and events. And also, if you want to write to us and suggest ideas for webinars for the future, we would love to know what you want. We look forward to seeing you again. And now, if you want to stick around, please use the button in participants to raise your hand, the virtual hand raising button. And if you don't know how to do that, ask one of our wonderful tech people. Thank you so much, and we're glad that you joined us tonight. Stick around if you want to.
We will answer their questions by email.
Yeah, oh, and we'll also answer your questions by email. Yes, yes. Just info@nuclearband.us.
Okay.
So I see that Cheryl has her hand up.
Okay.
Okay, it's probably a question for you, Tim.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
Yeah, hi. So I thought we had to raise our hands if we wanted to stay in the
Oh, you don't have a question. Okay.
But
No,
I can always, I have 22 different questions I can ask you. You know
just one,
me.
please. Just one.
Yes, well, so I'm still struggling with this issue. Let's use Honeywell as the example, because they're in so many countries. I'm still struggling with how the treaty being ratified by, let's say, Mexico
Mhm.
will affect Honeywell's operations in Mexico. They're not actually making the weapons in Mexico. They're probably making air conditioning and things
Right.
like that. So
Right.
where's the connection? How can we bring that connection to fruition then?
Well, I was trying to say that this is not clear yet, because it will depend on the countries that have so far ratified, and there will be more before the end of next year. But at the end of next year, there will be the first review conference of the treaty with all those countries participating, and they will sit down, and that is when they will start discussing. I mean, hopefully they'll discuss it before that. As I said, Ireland has already, jumped the gun on that, but they will have to discuss and agree, and there will be differences in different countries as to how they interpret their requirements. But in the case of Honeywell in Mexico making air conditioning, for instance, the question is, first of all, depending on what the Mexican law that implements this treaty says, but it would probably be the case that the Mexican government would not be buying air conditioning from Honeywell in Mexico, because that would be assisting them. It certainly would be the case that they would not allow Mexican government funds to be invested in Honeywell, but it may be the case that they make it illegal for anybody else to have investments in Honeywell in Mexico. So it will depend, and it also depends on other bigger factors. For instance, I mentioned about the International Criminal Court. Now, there's discussions which would certainly come into play if a nuclear weapon were ever used. And of course, if you can't use a nuclear weapon, it kind of makes it a bit pointless to be threatening to use it. But anyway, there is still a question as to whether the International Criminal Court would make it a war crime, not just to use a nuclear weapon, but to have anything to do with a nuclear weapon, as the treaty says. Because then there would be a risk of, the CEO of Honeywell going to visit their plant in Mexico and being arrested under the International Criminal Court while they're in Mexico. And then, there's all those kinds of things which could, we don't know yet, but there are things which should at least make these companies a bit worried about what's going to happen. And that's part of what this treaty is going to do. It's going to put enormous question marks and anxiety and pressure on these companies and on the investors, especially, but potentially on the employees in those countries, on their suppliers, on the kind of contracts that they have with government or with other parties. So that's best I can do on that one.
I have a question from Dennis Wong. See, he has his hand up.
Yes. How does the idea of nuclear-free zones, countries who have it, how is it different or compatible with the TPNW and moving forward as far as the ban of nuclear weapons?
Well, that is a good question. The many parts of the world, including most of the parts that we're currently talking about. So Latin America is a nuclear-free zone. Africa is a nuclear-free zone. Southeast Asia is a nuclear-free zone. Antarctica, Central Asia. These are all zones that the countries have said won't allow stationing or use of nuclear weapons. They don't go the whole step, which is what I was trying to say about this treaty is about everything to do with nuclear weapons, and that especially is about the companies that are involved. So nuclear-free zones don't enter into that in these international nuclear-free zones.
Aren't they prime targets to sign the TPNW?
Sorry?
Just
I missed what you
aren't
said.
they prime targets
Who
Am I-
who are prime targets?
The nuclear-free zone countries.
No, I mean, most, I mean, the U.S. again, there's so many contradictions to the whole concept of nuclear deterrence. But if you know about negative security assurances, which is what the U.S. and all the other nuclear countries have given to the rest of the world to say that, don't worry, we're not going to ever attack you with nuclear weapons as long as you are not threatening us with nuclear weapons, basically, is what it says. And so all the nuclear-free zones are not targets. They're actually safe zones, as it were. I mean, whether, you know, how much you can rely on the promise of a U.S. president to say, well, I'm not going to attack you, you know, I don't know. But that's what those commitments are. So, you know, it's kind of, I mean, it was a very, very important development at the time, as was, you know, the INF Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty and all these other agreements. Now that we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, all these other mechanisms and agreements are kind of beside the point, because we're talking about eliminating them altogether and getting countries to make that commitment and have nothing to do with them, and putting pressure on these companies, which is going to finally get us there. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Peter Metz has a question. He's muted. I don't know if... Okay.
Peter Met, you want to unmute yourself, or?
Yes, I've done that, and here we go. Okay. Timmon, first of all, thank you for just a spectacular presentation. I mean, it's just so full of information, and I'm applaud the depth of your knowledge. I want to make one interesting point, and then I have a question. The interesting point is that one of the first states to ratify the TPNW was the Holy See, led by Pope Francis. In fact, I believe they ratified it on the first day available. So they were amongst the very, very first. Clearly, Pope Francis is very committed to this concept, and he's called nuclear weapons and have anything having to do with them immoral. But the Holy See that puts the Catholic Church on record as opposed to nuclear weapons. Now, it hasn't had any practical impact yet, but it's a very important ally and not to be overlooked. It's a tiny, tiny little country, of course. It's a postage stamp, but it is the home for a huge number of religious followers. And if the Holy Father ever chooses to exercise his ability to try to sway all those folks on this, which I dearly favor, it could have quite an impact. My question is the effect on companies, or the effect on leaders of companies, it seems to me, from what I learned today from listening to you, is entirely dependent on local legislation in the countries that have become members of the TPNW, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you ratify the treaty but don't put into effect legislation that holds corporations and corporate leaders responsible, it's not going to have any effect on them. Is that right?
Well, I mean, yes, that is correct. And as I said, with the cluster munitions, for instance, you know, the two countries have so far, anyway, you know, registered their interpretation officially as to this assistance clause, saying that this applies to investments. So, you know, 32 of those countries have said that very specifically. The others have not yet, even on the cluster munitions. So I mean, it's going to take time, and not every country is, you know, it's a very brave, courageous thing for any of these countries, as I keep saying, you know, to stick their neck out and go against the U.S. and these other, you know, big powers.
Right.
So it's not easy to do that, and there, you know, there are going to be economic consequences for some countries that, the US gets mad at them for doing this, but there's strength in numbers and they're all committed to this process. And so it's part of our work as ICANN, the global movement with 500 or 600 organizations in 100 countries that have pushed this treaty. It's our job to keep pushing and to make sure these countries do deliver on these commitments and do as much as possible to keep that pressure up, because they all are doing this because they want to get rid of these weapons. I mean, that's why everybody's doing this. So it's in everyone's interest, despite all these pressures that they're under, as I said, to try to do our best to do this. And like you said, having the Pope on board and the Dalai Lama and all kinds of other moral leadership has been a big important factor in this. We continue to have that. The International Red Cross, which has something like 37 million. I mean, nothing like the Catholic Church, obviously, but I mean, they have branches in every country. They have volunteers, millions of them, and they're utterly committed to this project. So we're not, the work isn't done yet. We still have a long way to go.
Right.
And especially in this country where people don't even know about the treaty. But there is a lot of very serious commitment going into this, and we just have to keep pushing.
Is ICANN offering a set of model statutes that a country could enact once they become a member?
Yes, they have. They have done that already, and as I said, Ireland's already done it. So, but that's something that we're, I mean, not everybody, even in ICANN, is looking at it quite this same perspective. So we're trying to push this whole, pressure on the companies as far as we can. I mean, Don't Bank on the Bomb is very much on that wavelength, but not everybody is. Some campaigners are trying to, don't want to push countries too far so that they don't actually sign and ratify. If they think that they're going to be making more of a commitment than they can do. So there's all kinds of different perspectives on that. But ICANN has got draft legislation that's all gone through UN channels as well, because the UN is the depository for this treaty, and the whole UN system is there to support countries implementing it. They provide assistance to them to ratify it and to implement international legislation. So a lot of the small countries, for instance, they rely on that kind of help because they don't have even the legal support.
Right. Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Christine has a question.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much, first of all, for the wonderful lecture. It was very informative. As I said in the chat, there's enough information for a number of research papers right there. My question has to do with whether or not there's a network that manages how these movements are developing in each country, and also trying to reach out to people in new countries and try to get more countries to sign and ratify the treaty. If no, then what are some platforms that we can use to make sure that all of these smaller networks in each country are also part of a more global effort to just put more pressure behind, put more force behind this treaty? Thank you.
Sure. Well, that's what ICANN is, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. It's the umbrella for, as I said, almost 600 organizations in 100 countries, and that is the mechanism for trying to coordinate globally and supporting all the different countries, including ones that haven't got a group in. I mean, one of the exciting things about ICANN for me is that I'm used to working with activists in Western Europe and America, where people get out on the streets and they do stuff, and ICANN they do have activists in America and in Western Europe, but they also have activists in Mongolia and Colombia and Brazil and Angola and Zimbabwe. You know, I mean, they're all over the place, and in some of the most unlikely countries, and they're very, very committed to this. And so, you know, we have this fantastic network. They're almost all young people, apart from me and Vicky, and you know, it's a fantastic group. And I hope that you and others will get a chance to meet and be part of that when the COVID ends, because they have put on all kinds of, you know, academies and training, you know, weeks and whenever there's an opportunity to get together, which there will be sometime next year when there is the first treaty review conference. That's going to be a very, very exciting moment. It's probably going to be in Austria, because the Austrian government is trying to, you know, insist that they have it there, because they're one of the key countries supporting the treaty. But wherever it is, it will be an international gathering, not just of the countries that have ratified, but also of all of our ICANN partners around the world, where we can really get together and thrash things out and discuss things and support each other. And you know, one of my dreams has been to try to get some of these people. You know, we have a campaigner in Kenya, we have a really good campaigner in Costa Rica, and you know, to get them to come to the US and just talk to people about what all the things that they're doing in those countries, you know, would just be a great inspiration for people here. But you know, we can't do anything right now, and of course it, you know, costs money and all those kind of things. But thanks for your question. Yeah.
Sorry, Packy has a question.
Okay.
Hi. Well, first of all, just thank you. My head is swimming with all your information. But it's a nice pond to be swimming in. Back to that wonderful graphic of the pieced off with teeth. You were alluding earlier to these other countries where I'm wondering, do we have examples of the teeth? Do we have examples of people making even slight inroads? Because I mean, this is big, you know. And I think about Ireland and how, you know, there've been wonderful protests there that have been very effective, and I wonder if you have anything concrete that is taking place in Ireland or anywhere else.
Concrete taking place in Ireland? You mean in terms of like arresting
No,
officials?
no, like actually making a mandate to stop doing this, to you know, if you don't stop producing nuclear weapons, we're not going to buy your air conditioners.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. So that's something we still need to look at. You know, as I said, I was surprised to find just in the last few days when I was researching for tonight that Switzerland has this law since 1996, which included, you know, making it illegal to invest in nuclear weapons. So I don't know. I mean, we have the examples of all these institutions and banks that have divested, but in terms of like Ireland, for instance, I mean, Ireland's going to be confronted at the first treaty conference about, you know, what are you doing about Shannon Airport, for instance, as is Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is still selling uranium, as far as I know, to, or maybe they've got some connection to uranium still, and so there's going to be questions about that. And but in terms of like, you know, telling Honeywell that we're not going to get your air conditionings, I don't have examples of that yet. No, I mean, we have the cities in the US that have been doing that, but we don't have countries examples yet, and that's something that we, you know, it's going to take time. As I said, in that first review conference, which is in a year, probably in November next year, that's when we're really going to be able to, you know, talk to the different countries and see what they're actually going to do. But we can use the time between now and then to really, you know, get that idea out there.
And be good US activists too. Thank you, Tim.
Right. So maybe we have time for one more question, and then other questions. I mean, we can go on all night, but I don't think we should. I think we probably should stop soon.
Anne has her
But we
hand up.
will, but we will promise to answer your questions in the email. Yeah. And somebody?
I'm from Kansas City, and Honeywell manages our plant here that makes 85% of the parts for nuclear weapons for the US and some for the UK too. And every Memorial Day, we go out there and get arrested, and the police are very friendly. They know us. It's no big deal. It's the easiest arrest you'll ever do. So I invite all of you to come to Kansas City on Memorial Day.
Okay, great. We'll be there. Thank you. Maybe we can fit one more in then.
Chuck, he has had his hand up for a while.
Go for it, Chuck.
Yeah, I think I've got my answer from what you've said based on what you said to other people, but your interpretation is that obviously one route for getting these purchasing restrictions would have to be through the countries themselves. It's not inherent by signing the treaty that they have that. They actually have to pass their own laws to decide how they're going to observe it. And at this point, we don't have any countries that have passed laws that say that they aren't going to purchase. There are things in the treaty that they can't do, but that's not one of them. But you're thinking that maybe something that can be brought up at the first meeting of states parties would be restrictions of that type as well. So, okay, so I just wanted to understand, because for a while there, I thought you were saying that just by signing the treaty, somebody would get arrested based on.
No, I'm saying that
you were talking about Mexico as an example, and that the Honeywell wouldn't be able to sell its products there because Mexico had signed the treaty, and that's at this point not the case, right?
Right. No, I mean, what I'm saying is that firstly, we want the CEO of Honeywell to be worried about what could happen. That's part of what we're trying to do, and part of the pressure on these companies isn't just that these countries will do that, but that they could. So that's part of the pressure. But the interpretation of the assistance clause is the big question, and I think that we as ICANN and you as ICANN, we need to be putting pressure on these countries. I've talked to some of the people in UN missions in New York, at least, about this, and they're from Austria and so on, and they're interested in how we can use this treaty to really get rid of the weapons, and not just it's not just about fine words, it's about putting pressure.
And we've already seen that with some of the sovereign wealth funds, which you talked about when you had that slide where the public pension funds have divested from nuclear weapons in several European countries at this point. The Swiss law is a really interesting one. So I think there's obviously a lot of possibilities in certain countries, but I think it's going to be hard, particularly for some of these smaller countries or less affluent ones, to maybe get them to do something like this really quickly. But anyway, I think it's great that you brought all this up, and thank you for doing that. Thanks.
Well, it's gone 8:30. Do people had enough?
There's just one more question.
Okay, one more question. Okay.
From Mary Ellen.
Okay.
Still on.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, I was just curious, Tim, what brought you to this work in the first place? I mean, obviously you've dedicated your life to this, and I'm just curious, what got you into it?
Well, I was actually an environmental campaigner in my youth, and I got involved in the nuclear power campaigns at Seabrook and in Scotland at Torness, and I got very committed to trying to to the dangers of radiation in particular. And then I went to hear Helen Caldicott, who I think has influenced a lot of people, maybe a lot of people on this call, but she just said flat out, if you're worried about nuclear power plants, you need to be really worried about nuclear weapons. And that was back in the 70s. And like many people, you know, I got involved. I ended up at a peace camp outside a nuclear missile base in England, and was very active in those days. And then when the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down, I thought, you know, phew, we can do something else now. And I was wrong. We're still here. So that's me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, well, thank you so much, everybody, for sitting through this. I don't know how many people we ended up with in the end. We've got 45 on right now, but thanks so much for everybody. This was an experiment. You know, we've as Vicky said, you know, we've done a lot of campaigning, and we've been all over the country doing workshops, you know, what you can do about nuclear weapons and talking about the dangers and all the rest of it. And I just really wanted to actually get into the detail nitty-gritty about this treaty, because I think so few people know about it. And for me, it's the most exciting thing out there. It's got so much potential, and I hope that you all take that away and help us work on it. And we're going to get rid of these weapons. That's it. So thank you very much, and good night. See you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great job.
Great
Oh.
tradition.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Oh,
Bye.
no, here I think. See,
Well done.
Here-
Wonderful.
here? I don't know.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank
Don't
you.
forget
Yeah,
to
thanks.
save the chat.
Save the
Save
chat.
the chat.
Somebody's still coming in now. I don't know.
How do you save? the chat?
Yeah, I
Do you do
I
it?
just did it. I think you
I
press
tell you,
file.
you go down to the bottom of the chat where it says to everyone.
Yeah,
You look over to the
Oh.
right-hand side of that little window. There's 3 dots.
yeah.
You hover over the 3 dots. It says more.
Oh, save
You
chat.
click more,
Save chat there.
and it
right.
says save chat.
Got it.
Ah, thanks,
Got it.
Cheryl.
And then you find it. There's a special. Then you have to know where to look for it.
right,
There
right.
Zoom puts a directory on your computer in some directory. It'll be called the Zoom directory.
Okay.
It'll be in there.
Thank you.
Then you hit this button that says save the planet, and I think you just did that. Thank
Right,
you.
there we are.
Thank you so much, brother. Wow,
Yeah.
great job.
Thanks,
Great.
everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.